So, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuhu and good day to everyone viewing this video. So, in this video, we will discuss the last topic entitled Prospect and Retrospect. Okay, so some of you may ask, what's the connection between the title Prospect and Retrospect to our discussion? Now, our discussion is actually an extensive view of semiotics. It is beyond the traditional semiotics that we previously discussed during our preceding discussions. So these discussions, it will be tackling about structuralist semiotics, post-structuralist semiotics, the methodologies a semiotician may use in presenting his or her analysis, and for the last part, we have the ecological and multimodal approach towards semiotics. So with no further ado, let's get right into our discussion.
Structuralism. Now, structuralism acknowledges the existence of a fixed real world, one where you have ideas that rest upon a bedrock of material relations, whether they human, whether they be social, or whether they are economic relations, or even a combination of these three. Now, structuralists like Saussure, Roland Barthes, and others believe that there exists a coherent system upon which meaning is constructed in a similar function for each individuals. Now, this overarching system places limits on all truth, all thoughts and meanings for majority of world's society. For an instance, what people believe in Afghanistan may mean the same thing in the United States of America. Structuralists didn't want to be called structuralists, but the fact remains that many of these theorists, in one way or another, put forth the idea that supported monolithic institution. It means that it operates as a source of all meaning, all purpose, and all action in the world. Now, under structuralist falls the stance of Ferdinand de Saussure as what we refer to as the radical arbitrariness. Now, when we say arbitrariness in linguistics, it means that there is no logical or there is no intrinsic relationship between the signified and the signifier. For example, the word dog. Now, in an English society, this term can refer to the four-legged animal. However, in an Urdu speech society, the word dog could refer to a person who is committing a crime, and so on and so forth. Now, this radical arbitrariness of the sign by Saussure was even referred to as illusory dogma. Illusory dogma, or basically a set of principles that are solely based in illusions. This particular emphasis of Saussure on his arbitrariness was actually based on his adoption of language as his model for semiotic science, in which even Jacobson acknowledged by stating, quote, the predominantly symbolic character of language. Now, subsequent structuralists tried to apply verbal language as a model to media which are non-verbal. Now, this is seen by critics as failing to allow for the diversity of media. Now, Jacobson rejected this criticism and stated that, quote, I have looked forward to the development of semiotics, which helps to delineate the specificity of language among all of the various systems of science, as well as the invariance binding language to related science systems. Now, despite of this stance by Jacobson, a key example of the problem identified by critics is that analogical images, like in traditional painting and photography, cannot be unproblematically reduced to discrete and meaningfully recombinable units in the way that verbal language can eventually. Yes, we may acknowledge the role of conventions in a particular painting. However, in the case of an indexical medium such as photography, common sense suggests that we are dealing with a message without a code. Thus, semiotic references to reading photographs, reading films, and television lead some to dispute that we really need to learn the formal codes of such media in order to be able to give meaning to them or to understand them or to interpret this media. Now, it has been argued that people draw on both social and textual codes in making sense out of a picture or the likes, because indeed we really do. But we also draw more broadly on both social and textual knowledge. Not all of such knowledge is actually reducible to codes, and we cannot identify what or which codes to invoke in meaning making without being knowledgeable or without knowing the certain context. Now, take for an instance, when I utter the word coffee, take note of the rising inflection along with the question mark. When I utter the word coffee, I could mean different things. It could be interpreted differently, again based on the context that it is being used or this word is being used. Now, when I utter this word, I could mean that I'm offering you a coffee, or I'm asking if that's a coffee in your hand, or the likes. So again, the meanings of a certain word is basically dependent on which context the word is being used. Sign systems. Now, in semiotics, sign systems are the universal key concepts in which are used to refer to any signs. Now, did you know that there is no ideologically neutral sign systems, because signs function as to persuade as well as to refer. As Valentin Voloshinov declared, quote, "Whenever a sign is present, ideology is present too." Now, this leads to the particular principle of semiotic analysis, that semiotic analysis eventually always involves ideological analysis, or the analysis that focuses itself on the investigation of beliefs and values which are embedded within a specific text. Now, if we can notice, the legacy of the Saussurean tradition was actually focused on synchronic rather than diachronic analysis. Now, when we say synchronic analysis, it is a study on a phenomenon as if it were frozen at one moment in time. Now, on the contrary, diachronic analysis focuses itself on change over time. Now, the synchronic approach unfortunately underplays the dynamic nature of sign systems. For instance, television conventions change fairly rapidly compared to that of the written English. Now, it also underplays dynamic changes in the cultural myth, which signification helps to shape our society. Purely structuralist approaches have not yet addressed processes of textual production or audience interpretation. They have even downplayed or have even neglected the cultural, the social, economic, and political contexts in which are highly significant with respect to meaning making. Now let us proceed to post-structuralism. Now, post-structuralism doubts the existence of a concrete reality. People like Foucault, Stuart Hall, and others emphasize that ideas about the world or ideas about our reality is dependent upon constructed discourse in society, like the way we speak, the way we communicate with each other, the way we respond to that particular communication, and so on and so forth. Now, the post-structuralists were not actually relativist, but they did argue that universal truth, if it does exist, is unknowable. Because of the existence of multiple truths, there exists a certain amount of ambiguity and tensions that is not fixed. Because meanings are forever shifting, and because meaning are not static. Post-structuralism also focuses on polysemic media artifacts. Where you have a given artifact, which could be a television show, a musical composition, a television variety show, a film, a painting, and so on and so forth. And all of these possess multiple meanings depending on the intent of the creator or the producer and the reception which is eventually given by the audiences. Now, the improvement brought by post-structuralism to structuralism is that post-structuralism allows for the presence of difference among social and cultural phenomena to be observed and eventually analyzed and understood. Now, post-structuralism also leads to a possibility of struggle against dominant meanings, which can eventually lead to challenging, to ameliorating, or even destroying institutionalized ways of thinking and doing. Now, unlike structuralism that looks for overarching systems that bind people together, post-structuralist looks at the malleability of human existence, or how our differences account for new ways at looking at social and cultural formation, as well as the complex ways of institutions functions in society. Now, if one can notice, under post-structuralism, the social context is greatly considered. Therefore, the semioticians under such approach tend to adopt constructionist stances, emphasizing the role of science systems in the construction of our reality. Now, the semioticians usually refer only to social reality as constructed. Now, some even argue that there is nothing natural about our values, but they are social constructions which are peculiar to our location in space and our location in time. Now, this social constructionist stance, it is not an idealist denial of external physical reality, but rather it is an insistence that yes, things may exist independently of science. We know them only through the mediation of science, and eventually only see what our socially generated science systems allows us to see. Okay, so since the second half of the 1980s, social semiotics has been adopted as a label by members and associates of the Sydney Semiotics Circle. Now, few of its original members include Gunther Kress, Theo van Leeuwen, Paul Thibault, Terry Threadgold, and Cranny Francis, and Michael Halliday, who has influenced the field greatly. Now, he is a British linguist whose functionalist approach to language stresses the contextual importance of social roles. Now, the Sydney Semiotic Circle didn't view social semiotics as a branch of semiotics, but they had viewed it as a brand of semiotics which is positioned in opposition to the traditional semiotics. Now, this school, the Sydney School, has actually adapted and adopted some of its analytical concepts partly from structuralism, while defining itself largely in opposition to the Saussureans' analytical priorities. Now, the key difference in this respect is that this school has set itself the task of investigating actual meaning-making practices. Okay, so in this part, we are going to identify some of the methodologies used by the semioticians in presenting their analysis.
Now, sometimes semioticians present their semiotic analysis, as if they were purely objective accounts rather than subjective interpretations. Now, there are also those semioticians that seem to feel much need to provide empirical evidences for particular interpretations, and much semiotic analysis is loosely impressionistic and highly unsystematic. Now, there are also some that seem to choose examples which eventually illustrate the points they wish to make, and rather than applying semiotic analysis to an extensive random sample. Now, semiotic analysis requires a highly skilled analyst if it is not to leave readers feeling that it merely buries the obvious in obscurity. Furthermore, few semioticians eventually make their analytical strategy sufficiently explicit for others to eventually apply it either to the example used or to others. Now, many make no allowance for alternative readings because they assume that either their own interpretations already reflect a general consensus or a general meaning which already resides within the text. Now, structuralist semiotic analysis is just one of the various techniques which an individual can use to eventually explore sign practices. In relation to textual analysis, other approaches includes critical discourse analysis and content analysis. Now, speaking of content analysis, it involves a quantitative approach to the analysis of the manifest content of text, while semiotics seeks to analyze text as structured wholes and investigates latent connotative meanings. The structuralist semiotician is more concerned with the relation of elements to each other, while a social semiotician would also emphasize the importance of the significance which readers attach to the signs within a text. Whereas content analysis focuses on explicit content and tends to suggest that this represents a single and fixed meaning. Now, for this last part of my video report, we are going to talk about the ecological and multimodal approach towards semiotics. Now, we live within an ecology of signs that both reflects and gives shape to our experiences. Now, we must identify and recognize the importance, the significance of new literacies in this ever-changing semiotic ecology. Now, thinking in ecological terms about the interaction of different semiotic structures and languages eventually led the Tartu School cultural semiotician Yuri Lotman to coin the term semiosphere, that eventually refers to the whole semiotic space of the culture in question. Now, little do we know that there is this growing theoretical interest in multimodality. Now, this is the combination of different semiotic modes, for example, language or music in a communicative artifact or event. Now, this was foreshadowed in the structuralist studies of what Metz eventually called the intercodical relations, including Barth's exploration of relations such as entourage between images and words. So, as to conclude my discussion, a working understanding of the important key concepts in semiotics can be seen as very essential, especially for those who wants to study or just those who wants to merely understand the complex and the dynamic communication strategies within which we live. There is no escape from science, and those who cannot understand them and the structure in which they are a part of are in the greatest danger of being manipulated by those who can eventually. Now, in short, the field of semiotics cannot be left to semioticians alone.